taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for what we hope will be a very lively discussion on an extremely timely topic. Joining me today on our panel will be Ken Zocco, founder and CEO of Spatial Risk Systems, and Raymond Clark, SRS's Chief Product Officer. And they seem to be joining us from outer space at this point. So we have a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. What are we going to be talking about today? First, we give you a quick review of what we believe is the current state of environmental data as it pertains to US public finance. I will then introduce our new ESG data platform and all the various ways we have to add value to your ESG data and make your jobs a lot easier, and why it should be your preferred delivery mechanism for ESG data. I will then turn over the virtual podium to our partners at SRS, and they will walk you through their methodology for scoring climate risk at the local government and school district level. They will also walk you through a couple of real-life examples of how to use the scores. And then I'll come back at the end to let you know how you can access all this wonderful data through our platform. And we'll make sure we'll have a few minutes at the end to take any question that you might have. Next slide, please. Well, to say that ESG is a hot topic in the municipal market is probably the understatement of the year. Now that credit risk stemming from the pandemic have largely abated, it seems like ESG is now the #1 concern on municipal investors' mind. In fact, a recent survey by the Bond Buyer, which is, as you know, is our industry trade paper, found that 73% of the respondents, almost 3/4 of them, rated environmental factors as either critical or very important. Now, within the environmental section of ESG, really climate risk is the topic that people are most concerned about. And let's be clear, when we talk about climate risk, we're talking about more than just the annual hurricane events that always make the headlines. When we talk about climate risk, we're mostly talking about the systemic weather-related risk of constant flooding, drought conditions, lack of access to water resources, the kind of factors that eventually make residents want to move, will affect the demographic trends, and eventually will, over the long term, will erode a local community's socioeconomic base and its fiscal standing. We've heard that users right now feel overwhelmed by too much data, not too little, because there is an actual lack of an analytical framework, what they call a universal language, based on the same Bond Buyer survey that I mentioned. They also pointed out the need to take into account the multiplicity of municipal obligors. As we all know, there are anywhere between 30,000 to 40,000 distinct obligors in our marketplace, and the number is growing. It's quite the difference when you compare it to the corporate sector. And each obligor also has a plethora of bond security structures that we need to take into account also. And finally, what we've heard from in our travels is that there is a need for a relatively simple scoring system to drive investment decisions. Even though all the data is very, very interesting, nobody wants to take a look at 15 pieces of data before they can do a trade. Next slide, please. So in response to the needs that has been stated, we're very happy to introduce DPC Data's new ESG data platform. And in a nutshell, what a platform will do is allow credit analysts and risk managers to perform a combined analysis of financial and climate risk factors. And all this data will be presented and organized in a way that is instantly familiar to practitioners in US public finance. We intend to feature top ESG subject matter experts and best-in-class data vendors. Most importantly, the ESG data will be fully integrated with our current MuniCREDIT solutions suite of products. As you know, our MuniCREDIT solutions currently include a full set of financial and operating data for over 30,000 distinct obligors, and with complete QSIP to obligor to sector mapping for all outstanding US municipal securities based on our proprietary mapping methodology. We can also produce customized financial data reports. And most recently, we just rolled out an online tool called MuniCREDIT Online to give you quick lookup access to the financial and operating data for any obligor, either by entering a QSIP or by entering an obligor name. Next slide, please. So a couple of things to keep in mind, when we talk about the way we approach the ESG data. Right now, I think our initial focus will be primarily on the risk aspect of ESG, right? And we're also focusing on the obligor, the risk at the obligor level. As you know, our market has been very familiar with so-called green bonds and social bonds, but those really, when you talk about green bond, you're talking about the purpose or the use of proceeds of a particular bond issue. So to us, that's what we call that as an impact type of approach. What does that bond issue accomplish, or what is its goal in terms of achieving a particular set of socially desirable outcome. For our part, at least at this stage, we're focusing mostly on the risk side of the equation, because it dovetails very nicely with our traditional focus on credit data. So, please bear that in mind as we talk about climate risk. Next slide, please. And the biggest value added that we bring to the table here through our platform, we believe, is that everything, again, will be mapped all the way through from any kind of real world data that is available out there, from government sources or private sources, will be mapped all the way through to census tract IDs, to the FIPS scores, which, as you know, are the geo IDs that are assigned by the US Census and other governmental agencies, then to the correct municipal obligors. Now, this part is unique to us, we believe, because a lot of the current existing mapping methodology out there will only map to issuers. And as you know, in our market, issuers don't really mean a whole lot. If you take the example of the New York State Dormitory Authority, if you only map to the Dormitory Authority, you really don't know what your reference entity is, because the authority is the conduit issuer for as many as 300 distinct obligors, ranging from healthcare to higher education and whatnot. So it's a very important component of our methodology. Then finally, from the municipal obligors, we go all the way down to the individual bond QSIP level. And this is at a QSIP 9 level, meaning each individual holding in your portfolio. So with that, keeping that framework in mind, we're thrilled to kick off our platform with our partners at Spatial Risk System, or SRS. And I'm happy to turn the podium over to Ken Zoko, founder and CEO of SRS, who's a long-time data scientist, and he came out of FactSet, and also you will hear from Ray Clark, the Chief Product Officer, who's had some experience with Moody's. So between these two gentlemen, you know that they are very, very well versed in the needs, the database requirements of the investment community. So Ken.
Oh, thank you, Trit. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. So, it's really becoming apparent that climate impact and sustainability investing is really starting to take center stage. And measuring and quantifying spatial level risks is creating another path in which to evaluate municipal bond offerings, portfolios, and transactions. So with bonds and portfolios, they may have very similar characteristics from a terms and conditions perspective, but may have material differences when evaluating the spatial level risk for these governments and facilities. And this needs to start being factored into investment workflows in response to this changing investment environment. Spatial risk is really excited to be partnering with DPC, a market leader in reference and disclosure solutions for the U.S. municipal market. So measuring real-world impacts from climate, environmental, and socioeconomic change to governments, facilities, and organizations from both physical and financial perspectives, it's all around us, but it's extremely difficult to measure and quantify. SRS addresses this challenge by engineering a massive spatial graph. So think about the analytical framework that Treat was referring to before, right? Creating a data governance, a data set in which you can start to play this game and measure these real world impacts. So we've engineered this massive spatial graph, and when we standardizing hundreds of facility and location level data sets into a single fact table or knowledge graph. So really data governance is a critical factor here in able to kind of measure these impacts. So by analyzing 1 billion attributes in a data environment that is now optimized for machine learning and artificial intelligence, our SRS's AI-driven assessment model can now intelligently correlate and measure hundreds of underlying factors. And we encapsulate these assessments into the SRS risk scores rating methodology. It's a library of about 100 factors measuring real world impacts, and it grows every month. So by tapping into this factor library, institutions for the first time can evaluate investments and analyze municipal bond portfolios at a spatial dimension using these factors. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Ray Clark, our product officer, and he's going to provide you a detailed view of what I just alluded to.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for spending the afternoon with us, at least part of it. Lauren, you can just switch to the next slide, please. That was. All right, so as Ken mentioned, I mean, we have this knowledge graph, and out of the knowledge graph was born the spatial risk scores. And what they do is measure exposure to location-specific factors that have long-term effect on assets, value, environmental impact, operational effectiveness, and sustainability. The scores are a relative measure, and they're designed to cover risk across different locations and expose the driving factors in risk in each location. For example, if we say something is a risk score of 5 in one location, another location has a similar risk score of 5, it's not necessarily the same risk that's driving that score. We have to look at each location and see what those specific risk at that location is. We link those scores to DPC Obligor codes and QSIPs, allowing them to be appended to existing data such as pricing, terms and conditions, making it straightforward to embed into credit and portfolio related work. So, a lot of the heavy lifting and hard work has already been done. You can just append this data set to your current workflow and to get a real world view of what's going on in the ground where your Obligor exists. All right, next slide, please. So here we have, this is the SRS risk score in action. This is the state of Florida, all the counties. And basically, the SRS score is basically adding a new dimension to municipal credit risk, right? It's a new way to look at things. And the municipal and the spatial risk scores for this, in this case, they're all the top level scores, and they're made up of 4 component scores. There's the climate impact, environmental risk, social vulnerability and resiliency. And I'll touch on each of those as we go along. But this is the overall view in terms of the SRS score. It's you see from the legend here, you see a lot of green over here from the overall risk score, but Miami-Dade, you can see it down the bottom, it's a bit, it's challenging. It's probably about from this view, from SRS spatial risk score view, it's probably a 7-ish. But anyway, let's move to the next slide, please. So one of the component scores is environmental risk score. And what the environmental risk score does is measure risk from exposure to harmful environmental factors that will over time, have, affect an asset's value if left unchecked. And like here we see the percentile, we have a chart here, you see the percentile numbers where you have the averages for Florida for proximity to location to certain risk factors like the NPL sites, which is Superfund and RMP site facilities, which are two, you don't really, it's, you don't want to live next door to these sites, put it that way. And here in Florida, some of these, we break out Miami-Dade in the bottom, and the reason why it's bright red and brown is bright red, because you see there's a lot of these toxic release sites in Miami-Dade. It's 95, and the number of NPL sites is 6, which is the worst of the worst of the Superfund sites. So, these are the environmental risks that we have to look out for, and which goes into the spatial risk score. So we track all the environmental measures. We look, we quantify, we pull these information out of the knowledge graph to come up with the score and to look what's happening. But in these percentile numbers, we show you how the state and certain counties, Broward, in this case, Broward and Miami-Dade, stack up to the rest of the nation. All right, can we the next slide? So now we move to the climate impact score. And by leveraging the SRS knowledge graph and AI capabilities, we can now measure real-world impact of climate. We represent, and this climate impact score represents the overall risk from all possible types of natural disasters in Florida. So the first line in our graph, in our table, you see the climate impact score for Florida, the average Florida, then you see Broward, it's an actual score, in Miami-Dade, and these, that's a 7. And then you see the component, this underlying score for each of those, where we get them from, like hurricane is a 10, and you see basically cold wave, strong wind. So they're all ranked, in orders of severity, but it really doesn't stop there. Can I have the next slide? All right, so what just brings us closer to accurately calculating the financial cost and present and future natural disasters events tied to climate change. So we're using the climate impact to calculate these risks, right? So these are so basically the knowledge graph allows us to use, and using NRI data and FEMA, we're able to put a cost on these things and what these impact is. So you see for Florida overall, it's a pretty big number. And you look at the different counties and you can see where they pan out from the different things. Like for hurricane, it's, you can see it's a big number, 65 million. But what was surprising is that the tornado number is actually quite large for Florida as a whole. I guess that tells you the destructive power of tornadoes when they hit. So, which is quite interesting, actually. So basically, the knowledge graph allows us to comes up with these estimated annual loss numbers, and we make them available. So you can tie them back to where your obligors is and see what your risks are from that standpoint. Let's go to the next slide. So this slide, we're seeing this slide again because it's just go back into what makes up these things. You have the environmental risk, climate impact, social sustainability, and social resilience, which makes up the SRS risk score. But in each of these things, environmental risk, like the greenhouse gas emissions, climate impact, you have the asset exposure, historic loss rate, and resiliency, you have the well-being, economic outlook, infrastructure, and for vulnerability, what goes into it, age, gender, race, hundreds of other factors, crime, poverty, linguistic isolation, that makes it up. So we go down to the next slide. Next slide. And we look at the social vulnerability. So if any of the above things happen, the climate happens, environmental risk, this is the vulnerability of the community that the municipality would have to deal with, because they're at risk. And how they play against each other. I have both. This is the vulnerability slide, but I have resiliency number in here as well. And what vulnerability is in this case is the characteristics that might increase the negative effect of a natural hazard. So if there's an environmental hazard, climate impact, any of the, whether it's hurricane, tornado, whatever it is, these are the things that's going to play into the fact that a community can withstand the effects or not. So in this case, you have to look at the vulnerability and see where it stands. And if it's high, like in Miami-Dade is high, Glades, in the Glades, it's pretty high. It's a vulnerable community. You'd have to look at why. So eventually it would have to be addressed. So either it's being addressed when something happens, an environmental disaster or climate disaster happens, or it have to be addressed before these things happen, because we know something will eventually happen. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So now the resiliency score, which is basically just the flip of the other slide we just saw. So now we're looking at the resiliency number and with the vulnerability at the bottom. And resiliency is essentially demographic characteristics that might reduce the negative impacts of a natural hazard. And again, that's wealth. If you're wealthy, if you're well educated, if you're not too young or not too old, you can leave. If you have enough funds, you can leave an area, or you're better prepared. You have better building materials, or you're better prepared to deal with the hazards that come your way. So resiliency and vulnerability plays a big part. And it's, you have to pay attention to these factors as we make your investment decisions and we make them available to you. All right, so let's take a look at the next slide. All right, so here we also track emissions, carbon, the cost of carbon. And what we do here, we have scope 1 carbon, we have scope 2. So scope 1, it deals with the generating of energy. So if the municipality owns their own energy producing power plants, then they'll be in scope 1. Then we track their emissions and the cost of that. And if they don't, far more, well, not everyone does that, right? Not all municipalities own their own energy producing power plants, but everyone consumes, which is scope 2, which deals with the consumption of energy and the cost of it. So here we have some numbers, and for Florida, for the average of Florida, for scope 1, scope 2, and we break it out into the different counties. But we basically, you can see on the map, we track everywhere, across, which this is basically all of Florida, but we track the entire United States. We're tracking everything where energy is produced and what the cost is for consumers, what they're consuming. This goes back into the carbon for the municipalities and the cost and how we'll have to deal with that. All right, let's go to the next slide. And so, measuring spatial level risk, this is a school district. And again, we just break that, we showed all the school districts in Florida. And again, this is done across the United States, but we're focusing in Florida. What we do here, it's difficult to measure a school district, right? It's but we can do it. We do it because it has its own unique challenges in many instances. The district cross city and county boundaries and overlap with each other. So that's we address these challenges by leveraging the flexibility of the knowledge graph, aggregate and census tract level up to computer consolidated score for each school district. So it doesn't really matter where it is. We can draw on boundaries and create a spatial risk score around it based on where it is. We're not restricted by the census or whatever it says it is. We can create any boundary we want. So, which is really what a lot of school districts are. They don't fit neatly into anything. And you can just run your eyes over the colors of Florida. It's not surprising that Miami, which is density urban area, is more. It's a red. It's a vulnerable. The school district there is vulnerable. That's we find those factors. Actually, let's go to the next slide. That might explain. So again, this is Miami-Dade. So these are some of the data points that go into the knowledge graph that comes up with our scores and the things. We look at, all these underlying things, like the first thing, households making 200,000 or more, 6.4%, female household, no husband present. So these are all things that goes into our AI, into our knowledge graph. And we use these things, we look at them, we look at all these things. That's like we say the score, it's a relative score, but each thing, what makes up each score is different, it's unique for each locale. We're dealing with location risk. So this is just a glimpse of Miami-Dade and what we have there with what's affecting their scores. Health insurance, employment status, vehicles available, which becomes important if there's an event and you want to leave and there's no vehicles to leave, or just to hold a job, to get to work. This reliable transportation. Persons age 5 who speak English less than well. So basically, there's a plethora of demographic factors that go into the knowledge graph that goes makes up the spatial risk scores, and all the component scores work together to create the one score. But we can look at each individual component score and get an idea of what's going on, which is why we went through and look at each one as opposed to the overall risk scores. All right, I think that concludes my remarks.
Okay, thank you, Ray. That's very impressive. So now you're asking, how do I access all this wonderful climate risk data, right, on the DPC data platform? Well, basically, you can do it two ways. You can get it as a data feed of all the 5 scores that Ray has discussed, or you can also get it through our MuniCREDIT online tool, which is a web-based tool that will allow you to just look it up again on a Percusip or by putting in an Obligor name, and the layout in MuniCREDIT online will look approximately the way we're showing you here. You can see that you can see the 5 risk scores that SRS will be providing. But we also, and this is why it's so useful to have a combined financial and ESG platform, because here you can actually put the climate data in context, right? Because to say that Miami-Dade has $2 billion in potential losses, that really doesn't mean anything in a vacuum. You need to put it in the context of what are Miami-Dade's fiscal resources, what is its tax base, and so on and so forth, to be able to make a more accurate assessment. So we have also added some key ratios that will relate the climate risk data to some key characteristics of the obligor in question. And we just chose to start with a few simple financial ratios, like again, transition cost per capita. We also try to relate it to median household income, which of course is an eye-popping number, but and then related to the assessed value of the local community or the school districts. We also put it in the context of if they had to amortize this liability on an annual basis, what percentage of its local revenue budget would it take up, and so on and so forth. Of course, we're very much open to your feedback and suggestion as to which other ratios you would find very useful here. And we can also customize the financial ratio the way you would like to see it, within your analytical framework. So again, as you can imagine, combining the financial and ESG data is critical, because as you can imagine, climate risk is probably most important for the weaker, the financially weaker communities, right? Because they don't have as many resources, to withstand any kind of climate event. So next slide, please. So anyway, so I think that concludes our presentation. We have obviously a few minutes for to answer your questions. So by the way, if obviously we went through a lot of material, and if you're interested, we would be more than happy to schedule one-on-one calls to go again do more to get a deeper dive into either the methodology or the data, and certainly you need to see some demo the data. We be more than happy to provide them. So please reach out to us at the contact information on the screen. Lorraine, do we have any question?
Yes, we do. We have a question. What is the data that forms the basis of the transition cost estimate?
So Raymond, you want to handle that one, or you want me to take it?
Yeah, that's basically that's coming from the EPA data set, right? That's we're using the EPA estimated social cost of carbon for 2020 with a 3% discount rate, $42 metric ton. But yeah, it's all coming from we're basically, since we're using open data and we're putting this in a knowledge graph, that's one of the data sources, and we're able to use those data points. So yeah, we're using the EPA data, which is a short answer.
Great.
Yeah, I want to point out that a lot of the data that SRS uses are actually from public sources, which actually is to us is a positive, right? Because it takes away a little bit of the risk of being reliant on a proprietary data source. But what we do with the public data is where where we add value, right? So it's really it's not a trivial task to take the raw public data and turn it into a usable tool for your credit and risk analysis.
I just want to further add that, once again, open data. So our data sources are fully transparent, full auditability back to the source, open methodology. And, as this whole carbon game, as these climate and accounting standards kind of start to emerge, I think we're in a position with our methodology and how we connect and unify data is to fully support them.
Great. Triad, I have a question for you that came in by email. And the question is climate risk being priced by the municipal market? And if not, will it be, and when?
Yes, this is a question that comes up every time we talk about climate risk. And it's hard to tell at this point. It's certainly, as we all know, our market has enjoyed very, very strong technicals for quite a while. And as you all know, the market is really characterized by very low rates and very compressed credit spreads. So there's not a lot of credit differentiation at this point, but as we all know, that can change in a heartbeat. And I think really the catalyst probably will be some event or just even a significant market sell-off will be enough to trigger some kind of differentiation. And the next time around, people are going to start to take a look at ESG or climate scores and decide, hey, this is a name I don't want to own, even though by traditional benchmarks like ratings, they seem fine. But and at least I think this is kind of a great opportunity actually to restructure your portfolio to optimize your ESG exposure, because you're not really giving up any yield or to do it, because everything is so compressed, right? So you don't want to wait until you actually see a reaction from the market, because in that case that will be too late.
Okay. We have another question. It's a two-part question. Is the current data mapped at county or city level? And also, is the data available for all US counties and cities? So first of all, is the current data mapped at the county or city level?
Yes, it's mapped. It's actually mapped at every geographic level from census tract all the way up. Census tracts, towns, cities, zip codes. We can do yes. So the short answer is yes. It's mapped at every U.S. county, but every census tract all the way up from the smallest, which is a tract, then we aggregate all the way up to counties and state and everything else in between.
Okay. Okay, have another question here. In addition to reviewing public info, do you talk to those entities that are at greater risk to see how they are preparing for potential climate events?
We do not currently have any direct contact with issuers to talk in those regards. We will be working with, start to work with other folks who are in the natural language processing space. And so we can basically analyze and synthesize unstructured text on a real-time basis to provide some further context to help answer that question.
Cool. Okay, so we have quite a few questions here. So the next one is, are there specific ranges that are set by SRS to determine scores, good or bad, or is it all relative to peers? So in the example shown, the other counties.
So yeah, they're relative scores. They're relative to peers. So it's we break them out. The scores are 1 to 10, and like we said in my comments, what drives risk in one area is not the same that might drive risk in another area. But the risk scores, if it's a 5, it's still a 5. It just might be different risk factors that's causing you to get there.
All
Yeah,
right.
these are all relative, percentile ranking scores,
Yeah.
just to be clear. Because there's no such thing as an absolute score. It really isn't.
Yeah.
At least to us, it's not very helpful to have an absolute score.
All right, next question. Are resources provided by state level governments factored into the resiliency scores?
That's a great question. Oh, go ahead, Raymond.
I'll go ahead, Ken. You can.
No, I think, once again, we basically are using, a lot of different demographic factors from a lot of open data sources. So there may be a relevant open data set that we're not currently embedding in our graph right now that's going to provide incremental value to where we're headed. And one of our, I guess, best practice advantages that we're really good at data governance. So our ability to onboard new data sets into the graph can be measured in hours, days, and not weeks or months, and quickly get them exposed.
Yeah, this is a good, I should mention that even though you can see our approaches, we gear toward the investors' need. I think state and local governments could also benefit from this data, right? First of all, to prioritize the needs for either for mitigation policies, or to identify which areas within their respective states that might require some assistance. And I think this is really, we're only focusing on the risk side of the equation, but clearly, there is another side to the issue is what are the local obligors doing about the issue, and definitely I think there is a need for state and local governments and any local districts to take control of their climate narrative, right? Say yes, I think we have this risk, but this is what we're doing about it. And I think that they're going to really see the need for that as we go forward, because if nothing else, it will enhance the liquidity of their bond issues, and eventually will save them a few basis points in cost of capital.
Yeah, I agree. If you look at the social vulnerability and the environmental risk, and you look at their states and you go into each area and see what's driving those risk factors, either they'll deal with it in the front end, or they'll have to deal with it in the back end when they have to do cleanup and help those communities. So, it's eventually someone will have to pay for it.
Okay.
And I would just further add, if you think about, look, all the data we basically want to probably grab and measure is available in the public domain to a large extent. There's we do proprietary things as well. But if you think about it, most of these open data sets don't live at a company level, they live at a government or jurisdictional level. And so within our graph, we have a geo hierarchy, right? So we could quickly plug and play additional data sets, right? And the more things we can weave together and standardize under a single classification system, the bigger opportunity we have to use machine learning and AI to exploit those intelligent correlations and encapsulate that into a valid kind of spatial level risk score that can be relied upon and leveraged in the market.
Great. So next question, how do you consider once in a 10-year or 5-year type of climate event that could cause significant damage?
Well, we look at, I mean, these things happen, right? I mean, we look at Katrina. I mean, we look at Superstorm Sandy. We look at these things, but we basically, well, how we deal with that, we look at the resiliency of the community and say, can they deal with it? If you look at Katrina, it was this very socially vulnerable community with a lot of environmental risk factors in New Orleans. And if you look at New York, where Sandy took place, I mean, it had some has risk factors as well, as it's on the coast. But the vulnerability of the communities are different, and the resilience of the community is different. So when you have these events, you really need to look to the vulnerability and the resiliency of the community, because that will tell you what's going to happen. They'll give you a very clear picture of how it's going to play out, how it's going to, what's going to happen afterwards, because that's really what matters. They're going to need help during the event, and they're going to need help after the event, or are they going to be able to rebuild quickly? In the terms of Sandy, I think everything along the Jersey Shore, everything along New York, resilient communities, they were able to rebuild fairly quickly. I think maybe there was a shortage of building materials, but that's a different story. But everyone who wanted to rebuild was able to rebuild. They were able to tackle the FEMA documents, go the entire process with FEMA and do what they need to do. But if you're in a community where you're in linguistic isolation, or you have other demographic risk factors, you're not well educated, you'll have a problem dealing with some of these things. And so, I focus on the vulnerability and the resiliency of the community to see how things are going to play out.
Okay, great. Anyone have anything else to add to that? We have a few more questions. Okay. So next question, this one came in through email. How are multi-jurisdictional issuers like Bay Area Toll Authority or California Statewide Community Development Authority, just as 2 examples, how are they mapped and handled?
So they're going to be handled a different way, right? So, the school districts and the governments tend to be jurisdictional, right? The authorities are going to basically be evaluated on a facility by facility level basis. And so those facilities can live across a wide swath of a metropolitan region, right? And so we track where those facilities are. We basically can map them to their EPA profile. And then from that, we can then evaluate the spatial risk at that facility, whether it's at a census tract or city or county level. And then we can aggregate up from there, depending on, what kind of view you want to see. So let's say this authority, let's say the Port Authority's they manage 20 sites across the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, right? We'll track those. We'll identify the risk levels at those specific locations and aggregate up to generate an aggregated risk score for that authority, right? You play the same game on the corporate side as well.
Next question, can we compute other climate-related financial ratios from your data?
Yes, I think the answer is yes, and that's really, that's again, it's the advantage of having a combined financial and ESG data platform. You can be as creative as you want to be, and we certainly be able to accommodate any thoughts you might have.
Okay. And I have one last question, folks. We do have 5 or 10 more minutes. So if you want to put your questions into chat, we do have time for them. In the meantime, I will ask another question that came in by email. Can we export, excuse me, can we export these scores and data items into other internal workflows?
Yes, I think the answer is definitely yes. And as I mentioned, the data is available to just a simple data feed, along with our regular financial data also, by the way. And then you can import it into your internal workflow software or risk management software. It's a very easy and very simple process.
Yeah, from a financial symbology perspective, one of the great things DTC does is they map obligors to QSIPs, right? And then you can bolt on these scores to a security master, a pricing file, terms and conditions database, portfolio analytics layer, right? So it's a really straightforward plug and play opportunity to kind of quickly expose yourself to these spatial level scores and start playing with them to kind of get a better understanding of how they could work for you.
Great, thank you. So another question just came in. How do you think about testing the score relevance and accuracy?
Well, I mean, we've been testing them for quite a while. So we tested on historical data to see how it pans out. Like the New Orleans episode I mentioned briefly, we tested on, like, we look at wildfire risk across the West. We touch each individual component that goes into it. So I think we're in a perpetual testing mode. We're always looking at things and looking at the world and looking at, okay, how does this area look? You know, how is this believable? Is this score believable? What are the underlying risk factors at this location? We go down to the track, we look at zip codes, we look at, we see something in the news, it's okay, let's test our scores against it. But we do historical, we're also opportunistic. We see things happening and we run that area to see what we get, to see if it pans out. Like in the case of the Texas incident a few months in the winter, last winter, I believe, where the winter weather causes the power stations to go out. We were able to say, okay, that makes sense. It pans out in our graph. We're able to track that. We actually put something out in that when that happened, because we could see the risk factors there. And it's like, oh yeah, of course, there's winter weather risk there. So if you don't plan for that, then there's going to be disaster when something happens. You're going to have to have exactly what happened in Texas happen again if they don't fix it. In my local community, I look at it, there's winter weather risk, so I look at those. But the short answer is we test it against every scenario we can think of. We're always testing it. That's part of the big thing that we do, is to make sure that we're accurate, and we're always updating if we see something or we need to weigh something differently. We will do it. But we have our methodology on our website and what we're doing. And we're always updating it. We're always updating it with new data and new information based on what we see. But yeah, the short answer is we're always in a testing mode. We're always testing historically. We're testing in current events. We're looking at things that we try to challenge the data, challenge ourselves to make sure it makes sense and to give an accurate picture of what's going on, what's on the ground. It's location risk.
Yeah, I just want to add to that is that look, this is still early. We're in the first inning here, right? This is new for everyone. And, once again, getting back to, we built this massive connected graph of data, right? That gives us a fighting chance to kind of create a valid factor library, right? There's a lot of data governance that has to go behind the scenes to really kind of get to a methodology where you kind of feel confident in. It's still early, but we believe how we're approaching with the knowledge graph data connectivity is the right approach to kind of generate these factors.
Terrific, thank you. Asking the participants now, we do have a couple minutes left. If you have any final questions, quickly type them into chat. Otherwise, Tria, if you want to give us some parting thoughts.
Anything come on?
Well, we'll give them a minute. Is there anything else you wanted to add based on our discussion here?
No, again, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully you found the session informative. I think what we've tried to recreate here is really first attempt at integrating ESG data into credit risk analysis. And we're very thrilled to partner up with the folks at SRS, which are, I'm sure you've seen, are just wonderful experts in database, financial databases, and I think the end goal is really to have a Muni ESG platform for Muni people, not something that's imported from the corporate side. So something that will really, Muni professionals will relate to very quickly and very easily.
Great. Well, Well, we are pretty much at the end of our time here. There are no more questions from the participants. So Ray, Triet, and Ken, thank you so much for participating today. And have a wonderful afternoon.
All right,
Thank you.
All right, John.